Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Happy Monday.
That it is a happy Monday.
We can just give it one more minute.
And has any more people signed up for the work groups? Can you send me, or am I able to see as they sign up?
I don't think you will be able to see. I haven't checked today, but I'll let you know.
And for those of you who are just hopping on, we're just giving everyone a minute or two to join before we jump into the agenda. But it's really nice to have everybody here, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Heather. For those who have joined, if you could go ahead and put your name and affiliation in the chat, that would be helpful for us and for our record keeping, just to know who is here. My name is Annika Lefebvre. I'm the Food Systems Resilience Coordinator with the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, and this is the Communication and Coordination Committee for the Maryland Food System Resiliency Council. Should we go ahead and get started, Heather?
Sounds great. I know we've got a lot to cover in our hour together today. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather Bruskin. In my day job, I'm with the Montgomery County Office of Food Systems Resilience, and I also have the honor of being one of the appointed members of the FSRC. And so part of my role is that we convene these meetings every week during the General Assembly session to gather input and facilitate conversation around the food system related bills, as well as make sure all of our partners have the opportunity to be informed about what's being considered in Annapolis, and in hopes that you can take that information and connect it back to the work that each of you and your agencies and organizations do throughout the state. So I don't have any real formal announcements other than that, but many thanks to my colleagues who are joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Annika.
Great. So just a few meeting reminders for those who follow other FSRC meetings. The full council is meeting on February 6th, next Thursday. That will be the annual ethics training for council members. We'll also hear from Secretary Addix during that meeting about an upcoming program from Maryland Department of Agriculture. The next meeting for communication and coordination will be on Monday. It will be every Monday. We're just going to skip President's Day, which is in February. Environment and Production is meeting mid-February, February 13th, and Distribution and Access on February 27th. Both of those committees are in the process of getting their recommendations drafting going. So if you're interested in participating in those conversations, please feel free to reach out to me and I can add you to those meeting invites. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Annika. I am going to share this slide deck. I want to start by just reminding everybody of our tracking resources. We maintain the Google Sheet. It is linked in this slide here, and I know Annika will send out the slides after this meeting. We're updating that every day. We're getting to crunch time in terms of the introduction of new legislation. The deadlines for the House and the Senate to introduce new legislation without it having to go through a bunch of procedural hurdles is in the next week or two. So we expect to be adding a lot of new legislation to that tracking sheet. There's also a link here to our tracking calendar. So if you want to keep an eye on hearing dates for the bills that we cover on these calls or any other bills that might be of interest to you, we put all of those up on the legislative tracking calendar. Myself and Annette Hallberg, who I know is on the call and is our coordinator at the center for this project. And then I know last time we talked about how to register on the MDGA website, but if you haven't already done so, would reiterate my recommendation to set up a list there of legislation that is important to you. And with that in mind, we're going to talk about 4 pieces of legislation. I'm going to go through each of these one by one. I'll not only solicit questions, but if anybody has specialized knowledge of this bill or its origins or have spoken to a sponsor, please raise your hand, stop me, and we can discuss it a little bit further. So the first one we're going to discuss is House Bill 8. There's a hearing on this bill Wednesday at 1 p.m. in the House. This is sponsored by Delegate Harrison. This bill would require a food manufacturer, processor, or retailer to use one of the following terms in lieu of a sell-by date. So there's the quality assurance date, so when the food item that you're eating is not going to be good anymore, and then the safety date, which is when it's unsafe to be consuming that product. What this legislation would do is standardize those terms, at least for food that is manufactured, processed, or sold in Maryland. So the list of acceptable terms, best if used or frozen by, or use, freeze, or freeze by X. There are exceptions for infant formula eggs, pasteurized in-shell eggs, and for beer and malt beverages. For alcohol, obviously, the best wines are aged, so there's less significance to those used by or best if used by date. That means that the term sell by would be prohibited in most circumstances starting on July 1st, 2026, with the rationale being that it just doesn't give you enough information. do I have to purchase it by this date to avoid safety concerns, or is that just going to impact the quality of the food item? There's also a specific section about milk at sort of at the tail end of this bill. For grade A milk products, it'll be labeled with a description of that product. But the overall rules that are laid out in the rest of the bill do not apply to a milk product processed, packaged, or sold by distributors directly to consumers, or bulk shipment of milk between distributors. One other thing about this bill is that food with the sell-by date on it, which presumably may have come from other states, could still be donated in Maryland by the Maryland Food Bank, for example. It just could not be sold without having these other qualifiers. So with that, I will pause and see if anybody has questions or comments or knows anything about this bill. Diana.
I find this very interesting because it's been a topic at Distribution and Access, and it's actually one of the topics we're going to be exploring in our group meetings. So I think we had a presenter come and talk to us about it, and it's so much confusion about use by date, when can I use it, when it's no longer good, so on and so forth. So I think this is a really, I like this.
Other thoughts before I move on to the next bill? Dr. Lansing.
Yeah, I would just concur with what Diana's saying. This is something that we were talking about making into a formal recommendation for next year's Food System Resiliency Council recommendations for our now June report. So it seems to me that if they're already doing what would be part of our recommendation, that it would, reduce our need to make another recommendation, to be honest. So I think this is something we may want to follow closely, and I'm not sure, I'm not sure, Diane, how this might affect what we're doing in both your committee and our committee, Environment Production and in Distribution Access, but it seems like this bill's covering a lot of the things that we already talked about.
I agree. I
see another hand, Matt. Your hand is up. Matt Capodanno.
Yeah, hi. Sorry about that. My mic was muted. Matt here with Maryland Food Bank. We just had a couple questions on this bill about sort of the donation process for food banks and charitable organizations in general. We were a little concerned about the possibility of expired and otherwise unsafe food being donated to the food bank for us there. So we'll be chatting with the delegate probably this week and certainly listening on the hearing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Matt. If you want to see the section of the bill, and I'll post the text in the chat that relates to donation of items for human consumption after the quality date, it's on page 4 of this legislation. So, like I said, I will post that in the chat if I can get there from where I am in my screen.
Yeah, and Ben, I'll just add, I know when this has come up in other spaces over the years, not necessarily in Maryland, and I see Kelly is referring to a California law here. I know that concerns have been raised, particularly from the manufacturing and production sector, that this can cause kind of undue burden on producers and packagers to have to shift their their production mechanisms, and it's difficult when most of our food is coming from national and global markets, so it can potentially have impacts on availability of products in Maryland if a producer is kind of unwilling or unable to shift to align with a state-specific requirement. So that's not a perspective one way or another, just kind of highlighting. I know that's been raised in the past, but inconsistency is something that leads to a lot of wasted food when potentially that doesn't need to be the case. Kelly, do you know anything about the California law to share?
I
And
I was just trying to pull up a link to it because I think it I think it is very similar, like requiring the best if used by for quality and the use by for safety. So I think they largely harmonize, but I'm trying to pull up a link right now so I can compare. And I wasn't sure how the California law addressed the donation specific clause, which would be important too, right? In terms of like all the concerns you were just raising and liability protections. So I'll try to find it as we're chatting. I know we'll need to move on too.
thank you, Kelly. And Kelly is the executive director of Trash Free Maryland. So just celebrating her role there. Thank you. Well, Ben,
One
I
last thing on this bill is there's also an educational component. So the bill authorizes the production of educational materials to be publicized on like the state government's website once this law were to have changed. So some one pager about we're doing away with sell by dates. We're using best if used by or best if used by or used by instead. Any other questions on this bill?
Yeah, I'll try to look up the thing as well because we did analysis of the California law this fall and now I can't find it. But I believe this is congruent based on memory with what they're doing in California. But I don't want to promise that.
Stephanie, I think you're right, but I don't want to confirm.
All right, I will move on to Senate Bill 134, cross-filed as House Bill 42. The House bill is being heard first, which is why we're covering it today. It's being heard on Wednesday. Senate bill's hearing is on February 11th. We saw this bill proposed last year, so this will be review for those of you who were on this committee last year. Solid waste disposal surcharge and wasted food reduction and diversion fund and grant programs. So the bill does basically two things. There's a carrot and a stick as part of this bill. You have the establishment of the on-farm organics diversion and recycling grant program in the Department of Agriculture, which would award grants to eligible entities that develop and implement on-farm organics recycling and compost use, wasted food prevention, and food rescue. Then the stick end of the equation is establishing a solid waste disposal surcharge on the final disposal of solid waste in the state. So that would help fund the solid waste disposal, or I'm sorry, the Wasted Food Reduction and Diversion Fund and Grant Program. The fees collected from the solid waste disposal surcharge. There's a reporting requirement that beginning December 31st, 2027, the department reports all of the grants awarded and impacts on job creation, food producers, and on food waste reduction. Questions on this bill? I think we for those of you who were here last year, I think we definitely discussed this at length last year, but I know many of you were not here. So, Dr. Lansing.
Yes, we submitted testimony today on behalf of the Food System Resiliency Council because this did align exactly with one of our recommendations from last year's bill. So we decided as an executive committee that when leadership committee that when there's something that comes through that aligns specifically with one of our recommendations or were named in the recommendation, then we will consider it as a leadership committee and testify on behalf when it is, with in line with one of our recommendations. Or our stated statutes of the Food System Resilience Council. So in that vein, we did decide to submit testimony, and I will be giving oral testimony in support of this legislation this coming Wednesday for the House.
Great. Anything else on this bill? All right, seeing none, I will move on to our next bill.
I'm sorry, Annika, did we want to say anything about the what is it, the LSRC thing or not? I don't know.
The ILSR info sheet I know was posted as part of the agenda, was hyperlinked there, but I can pull that up. I think was Dr. Lansing, was that what you were thinking of?
Yeah, exactly. So they had, if individuals feel if they would like to sign on to that link or they have some sort of like, sign up thing and support, you're welcome to do that as an individual, but that's not something that we would do as the FSRC.
Got a thumbs up. All right. The next bill is a MDSE procurement bill. So it was actually already heard in the Senate last week, the 22nd, and I'll talk a little bit about what we heard from the recording of that hearing. The House Bill 56, has a hearing on the 4th at 2 p.m. So the House version of this bill is coming up. So this bill would give the State Department of Education the authority to engage in procurement of food by local systems without approval of any other procurement unit for locally grown food. And they define locally grown food in the bill. I'll get to that because there was something in the fiscal and policy note that was potentially problematic about their definition. But it's like a farm within a certain number of miles of the school, or if we're talking about fish products from the Chesapeake Bay, from the local farm and fish program. So they define like the geographical boundaries of what counts as locally grown food. The bill would require MDSE in coordination with the Department of Agriculture to provide a platform to facilitate the procurement of local food in local food systems. And there's an annual reporting requirement on all master contracts for food procurement from local school systems. So this would give MDSE, MSDE, a little bit of independence and authority on procurement as it relates to locally grown food, which usually comes under the watchful eye of the Board of Public Works. So that's the general purpose of this bill. Both MSDE and the Department of Agriculture offered favorable testimony with a couple of recommended amendments. There was favorable testimony from the Executive Director of the Rural Maryland Council and the Director of Government Relations from the Maryland Farm Bureau. And then there was written testimony submitted by Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Capital Area Food Bank, American Heart Association. The fiscal note and policy note talked about the definition that they provided for locally grown food. One thing that's potentially an issue here is that might give schools incentive to purchase food from other states. So let's say if you have a Maryland school that is in close proximity to the Pennsylvania border, they would be incentivized. There would be an easier procurement process for them to purchase food from Pennsylvania farms because they are closer geographically than, say, a farm in Southern Maryland. So that was just something that was pointed out in the fiscal and policy note. I'm wondering if that provision is going to be altered as this makes its way through the legislative process. But I will pause there and see if there's any questions or comments.
Leslie from MSDE, I know is on. Leslie, did you want to share some input? Thanks for joining us today.
Sure, and Steve, thank you for that letter of support. He just indicated that he submitted. So yeah, we're very excited about this opportunity, and I appreciate the follow-up with fiscal notes because I had not checked the Assembly site since the hearing. The bill indicates within 200 miles of delivery. So yes, that could include a border, a farm from a border state. One of the concerns that we have, and hopefully will mitigate over time, is the capacity of the certified farmers to or just all Maryland farmers to provide the quantities that are needed. So in time, we hope that can be mitigated, but right now we're trying to ensure that we can get the quantities that we needed. Just so you know, the USDA has been using a 400-mile designation, and we reduced it for this bill to 200 miles.
So what was his question now? Okay, that was you saying, hey, you've got too much, and the excess balance was.
All right.
I
Thank
don't
you.
know if, yeah, I don't know if that's someone's questions or picking up a different conversation.
So that's.
Any other questions or contributions on this bill? I put a link to the fiscal and policy note. The portion on the 200-mile radius is towards the end of the fiscal and policy note. Yes, Lindsay.
Hey, Ben, apologies for not reading this in advance, but is the certified local farm requirement part of the bill too, or not?
It is. Yes. So there's, if you look at the geographic boundaries, there's 3 qualifications as to what counts as locally grown food. So it's that 200-mile radius. It's food grown at a certified local farm and a certified Chesapeake invasive species provided by a certified provider. And it says that MSDE may not require certifications for good agricultural practices for these master contracts. So yes, it does include food grown at a certified local farm. Mark?
If that's the case, then I mean, certified local farm is required to have a Maryland nutrient management plan, so that, you know, at least to this point, would exclude any out-of-state farms.
So the issue here, and I think what the fiscal and policy note was trying to get at, is that this isn't an and, this is an or. So it could be within 200 miles, within that 200-mile geographic distance, but it doesn't also have to be a certified local farm, if that makes sense.
So it's open to any farm within 200 miles.
Exactly.
All right.
So what it says is this could potentially allow school systems to buy from producers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Virginia, Kentucky, New York, and Connecticut. The producers in those states do not have to adhere to Maryland's nutrient management laws. So this could potentially put Maryland producers at a competitive disadvantage since those producers are more regulated. But it's also worth noting that there's nothing in current law that prevents schools from purchasing food from out-of-state farms. So it might not make anything worse from that perspective. It's just something that's notable about the bill as it's drafted. Yes, and I think Annika noted that producers outside of Maryland could become certified local if they wanted to. Thank you, Leslie. And Leslie said that MSDE will give priority to those in the certified program. All right, any other questions on that procurement bill?
Hey, Ben, this is Lindsay again. So does that mean that all the Maryland farms have to be certified local, or because they're within the 200-mile radius, if they don't have that, although I guess most Maryland farms have nutrient management plans?
The way I read the text of the legislation is it has to meet one of those 3 requirements. So it has to be within that 200-mile radius, or it has to be a certified local farm or part of the Chesapeake Bay, whatever it is. Meaning, I don't read it, just looking at the text of the legislation, that's required to be a part of the certification program if it is a Maryland farm. But from what Leslie is saying is the department is going to give priority to those that are in the certified farm program.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? All right. The Maryland Farms and Family Fund. So the purpose of this fund, just for a little bit of background, was going to be a way to support our farmers markets and local and farm stands. So stands on the side of the road belonging to farms, to allow financing of purchases through federal nutrition programs like SNAP, WIC, FNMP. This was the purpose of the Maryland Farms and Families Fund program. What this bill does is it changes the program to be a match program rather than a grant program. So prior to this bill, the way existing law works is grants are given to nonprofits who match purchases at farmers markets or food stands from those who are using federal nutrition programs. I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Sorry, Ben. So just to clarify just a little bit. So what we intend to do with this legislation is reflect the reality of the Maryland Farms and Families Fund, which that fund was created a number of years ago as a grant program to nonprofits that can do a number of things. So there's only ever been one recipient of those funds. It's been either the Maryland Farmers Market Association when that existed. When that organization went defunct, it was absorbed by SMATIC with the help of Morbidco. So MDA has been putting out an RFP that through a really complicated series of, it's really long to get involved in, but Morbidco would apply for SMATIC because SMATIC couldn't apply directly. So we had to work with Morbidco, and now we're working with a nonprofit that Steve McHenry helped form to actually do that sort of thing. So it's like, we have these funds, we have to do an RFP, post it, wait for the period of time, grant the money to a nonprofit that then it ends up going to SMATIC. So to do away with all that complication, which honestly drives me nuts, is so now we are going to be able, through an agreement with the Tri-County Council of Southern Maryland, to give that $300,000 directly to the Tri-County Council and SMATIC for the program. That's the whole purpose.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mark. That clarifies things greatly from my perspective as well. So thank you for chiming in on that. Yeah, Leslie.
Hi there. Is there a local foods requirement for that? For this program?
Leslie, this is simply a matching program for federal programs. So any requirements for this are the requirements of those programs. So it benefits farmers markets and farmers that's on at farmers markets and farm stands. And so the majority of that food would come directly from local farms. There may be some that are purchased from other farmers. I'm thinking of the FMNP program. And the FMNP program's requirement is that it comes from the state of Maryland or contiguous counties and surrounding states. So it's a variety of requirements. This is matching federal funds. So no, there is no specific, not tied to certified local farm at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, Heather put a question in the, which I'm interested in too, in the chat. Will it affect Maryland market money?
No. So Heather, as you know, MDA has taken on the role of that Morbidco had previously done of serving as the fiduciary, I guess, of the Maryland Market Money Program. So, and so the Farms and Families Funds was not specifically meant. It did not name Maryland Market Money, but in all intents and purposes meant that, which is why no other entities ever applied for it. So that'll be $300,000 going to Maryland Market Money in addition to whatever Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Baltimore City, and whoever else kicks in.
Question. May I ask a question?
Of course, that's
All right, sorry. This is really a sidebar and probably, not probably, I'll need another conversation with Mark, but what I'm trying to get to is that we do have some money for the purchase of local produce to go to childcare centers, and we're trying to devise a mechanism for that. So if any of these programs that were just mentioned here are a way to get them to go to a farmer's market to purchase, I'd like to talk further about that.
I would say potentially, but I'll have to follow up with you on that.
Oh, okay, thanks.
And Ben, just to recap while we have Mark this topic. So when I had reviewed the bill, it seemed primarily like it was an administrative change and that there wouldn't really be any observable programmatic shifts. Is that right, Mark, or is there something that this would potentially adjust? I'm just kind of seeing the providing education piece, but I think that's probably just aligning practice with statute. Is that right?
I'm sorry, Heather, was that for me? I actually had a legislative analyst calling about this bill. I just had to tell her I'd call right back. What was the question?
Sorry, I just was saying my observation had been that this is primarily just an administrative realignment,
Right.
but that there won't be any observable programmatic changes.
No, that's not the intention at all. We just want to essentially make whoever's doing, like me, it's right now, it's my responsibility to implement this, and it's really complicated and it doesn't have to be. So we're trying to simplify it.
That's what I thought. Thanks so much, Mark.
Yep.
And thanks, Mark, so much for all the clarification. Perspective was super helpful. Anybody else have anything on this bill before we move on? All right. A couple of quick bills to review from last time since the hearings have not yet happened. The bill dealing with the Food System Resilience Council itself, we talked about how it's a administrative bill, just changing definitions of various terms and repealing outdated reporting provisions. The hearing for that is also on Wednesday in the House at 1:30 p.m. Similarly, the Food Forest and Foraging Program, which we talked about. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Lansing.
Just so people are aware, we will also be testifying in favor of that, as that is something that changes the terms from food desert to more appropriate terms. And there's other kind of statute things in there that specifically dealing with the Food System Resilience Council. So we did put in testimony and we'll be testifying for that on Wednesday as well.
Thanks. And Annika?
I'll just add that MDEM is planning to submit favorable testimony as well.
And just as a question, do we post on the tracker or elsewhere the testimony that comes from the FSRC?
We have not been doing that, largely since we were abandoning what we had done in previous years, which was tracking the voting position of this committee. But we're happy to we can add a column just for bills that the FSRC has testified for.
Yeah, I know it's already public record when it's submitted, so that might just make it a little easier to share and access.
Sure, and we can talk offline, Heather, and Annika about the best way to get that information, since we're not always privy to whether the FSRC is going to testify.
Thanks, Ben.
Mm-hmm. The Food Forest and Foraging Program bill that we talked about last time also has a hearing, same committee, 29th, 1:30. So that is coming up as well. There was one hearing on a bill that we discussed on the 13th, and that was for the Anne Arundel County property tax credits for supermarkets in food deserts. I know it's the disfavored term, but that's the term that was used in this legislation. Nothing much really happened at the hearing. It was sponsor testimony only, and there were no committee questions. So not much indication about what's going to happen with that bill. That hearing was in the Senate on January 15th. A few other bills that we're not covering in depth, but that have upcoming hearings that may be of interest to some of you. An agriculture, soil conservation, water quality plan bill, uses of information, that's tomorrow in the Senate. Maryland Agricultural Commission and Young Farmers, Senate Bill 240 also has a hearing tomorrow. And then a bill on admissions and amusement tax for food and beverages has a hearing in the Senate on Wednesday. And all those are available in the tracker. They just were ones we didn't elect to discuss in more depth at today's meeting. Any questions before I talk a little bit about the budget proposal? Cool. So many of you have probably seen the governor released his budget proposal as he is constitutionally required to do. This takes the form of 3 separate pieces of legislation. So there's the operating budget, the budget bill. We have links to those bills in this slide. This year, consideration of that bill will start in the House. They generally alternate years for the operating budget. The capital budget is the next bill that's listed there for capital projects. And then what's referred to in Annapolis as the BRFA, the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Bill. So any bill that will change already existing programs and funding streams without adding new spending, simply changing amounts to reconcile with current budget projections, that goes through the BRFA. Generally, the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, because it affects existing programs, is the most controversial, but we'll kind of keep track of the progress of all 3 of these bills. Many of you have probably read about the governor's budget proposal. It proposes approximately $2 billion in cuts. A quarter of those cuts would come from the rainy day fund, although the level of the rainy day fund would still be above the general recommendation. So about $500 million would be taken from the rainy day fund to help cover this budget shortfall. But the rainy day fund would stay above recommended levels. And then the remaining savings in the bill would come from various tax provisions, which I think was probably of lesser interest to those of you on the call here. So in terms of areas that stood out going through the budget, one item on the chopping block is the issuance of so-called disparity grants, which are given to underserved communities where the median income is below the state average. They're given for a bunch of different public policy purposes, and that's one of the areas that's marked for major cuts in the governor's budget proposal. And then in terms of what could be of interest to local governments, what they're worried about is there are some provisions for cost sharing or increased cost sharing on the part of county governments where the state pays a portion and the counties pay a portion. Some proposals in the governor's budget increase the county's portion of those payments. So things like certain pension and retirement programs. In terms of other impacts to our food system, I think it's unclear at this point. Most of those impacts would be downstream. There aren't any cuts that I can see to public benefits or anything like that. But I will leave it to Diana, who has a question.
No, it's just a question or a concern. I thought I heard that he also put cuts to DDA. And that would affect adults with intellectual disabilities, $10,000 per individual needed to be cut out of their budget.
Yeah, so that was another area marked for cuts. I know adults with developmental disabilities, the advocacy community has been pushing back against that. So I assume they're going to go in front of these budget committee hearings and try to reverse those cuts. But yes, that was another item among the proposed cuts from the governor's budget. And then there's also, there are cuts to the University System of Maryland. One other interesting cut is for the Blueprint education plan. they're slowing down some of the existing spending for a couple of programs under the blueprint. It's more of a reduction in the growth of spending on the blueprint budget rather than cuts to education funding. Any other questions on the budget? We'll track it as it goes through the process. Oh, thank you. So, very helpful note from Steve. The FSRC's request for $1 million for larger local farm food aggregation grants to public entities is not going to be funded next year because of our fiscal challenges.
Ben, this may be something that I missed, or it's just a little too in the weeds to know for sure. But I know that there are state grants to food assistance providers that are across the state. Is that included in the disparity grants bucket?
I don't think that comes from the disparity grants bucket, and I didn't notice any cuts when I read through the budget proposal, but there might have been something that I missed. But I don't think that would be impacted by cuts to the disparity grant program.
That might be a DHS question. Any questions or observations? I really appreciate Ben giving us a broad overview because I know there's a lot to process and a lot of difficult decisions that have to be made. So this was very helpful to me and I really appreciate that. So thank you, Ben. Anything from our colleagues on the call?
Last thing is we always put these important dates up. So we have our bill introduction deadlines coming up, like I said, over the next 10 days or so. Final introduction for bills without requiring suspension of the rules is March 3rd. Crossover date, March 17th, and sine die, April 7th.
Okay, well, I know that we are getting into the faster paced time of this session. And so we will continue to meet, as has been shared already, every Monday at 1 o'clock, except for President's Day next month. And so, our goal is to provide a balance of highlighting those bills that we think are most relevant to the FSRC community, while also in the tracker highlighting a much wider range of bills that are likely of interest as well. So please make sure that in addition to joining these calls, you take a spin probably weekly through that tracker, which is constantly being updated. And huge appreciation to our colleagues at CHHS for all the work that they are putting into keeping us as up to date as possible on this work. So thanks so much to Annette and Ben for all that you're doing. I think we've reached the end of our agenda, but is there any other comments, questions, observations, agenda items that I forgot about? All right. Well, Annika, we're good. Okay, super. Well, thanks so much to everybody. Please stay warm and safe out there, and we will look forward to reconnecting next Monday. And in the meantime, if there are bills that you think are important to highlight for the FSRC, please feel free to reach out to any of us to share both a heads up or any resource or informational materials that are important to be aware of. So thanks again, and see you all in a week.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.